Sarah Barnes stood alone in the unforgiving stretch of land that had become her home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the dry earth. The ranch, once vibrant with the laughter of children and the steady rhythm of work, now lay silent but for the creak of the windmill and the distant bleating of sheep. Her husband, Thomas, had died 2 years ago, a casualty of a skirmish over cattle. Since then, Sarah had fought a quiet war against solitude, weathering the isolation with only her 2 children, Peter and Ellie, to keep her company. The dust that clung to the earth had a way of seeping into her bones, reminding her of the land's indifference to human struggle. It was late in the day when she first saw him. A flash of movement on the horizon, a rider slumped over his horse, stumbling in a way that suggested injury. She had just finished feeding the chickens when the sight caught her attention. Instinctively, her hand went to the revolver at her hip, but she hesitated. It could have been anyone, a traveler passing through, or worse, an outlaw looking for trouble. But something in the rider's posture, the desperate way he clung to the reins, made her pause. The frontier was harsh, and a man like that would never last long on his own. She left the house, her boots heavy on the dirt path, and walked toward the rider. As she approached, she could make out more details. The man's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were torn, and the horse beneath him seemed barely able to carry him any further. She felt the pang of fear tighten in her chest, but she didn't turn back. He was closer now, and she could see the blood, dark and thick, staining his shirt, the gleam of sweat beading on his forehead. He collapsed before she could reach him, sliding off his horse and hitting the ground with a soft thud. Sarah knelt beside him, her breath shallow, her mind racing. He was Comanche, unmistakable by his features, the sharp angles of his face, the dark, braided hair that fell across his shoulders. She hesitated for a moment. The Comanche were raiders, feared and hated by the settlers. They had burned homes, stolen cattle, and killed without mercy. This was a man who would have been her enemy only a few short years ago, before her husband's death. But now, as she looked down at him, there was something about his vulnerability that stirred her, something that made her feel the sting of compassion more than the weight of fear. She reached for the rifle slung across her back, the barrel cold and heavy in her hands. But as her fingers brushed the stock, she hesitated again. No, she couldn't kill him. Not like this. There had been enough bloodshed in her life, enough hatred between settlers and native peoples. Sarah had seen too much death, too many good men lost to the land and to each other. She would not add another to that tally. Instead, she looked at the horse, the animal panting and sweating from exhaustion. Her mind raced. There was a chance to help him, a chance to show mercy in a world where it was in short supply. It wasn't much, but it was all she had to offer. Without another thought, she dragged the man into the shade of the barn, the afternoon heat already bearing down on them both. Inside the barn, she stripped away his bloodied shirt, trying to assess the damage. A deep gash ran along his side, and she could see the slow, steady pulse of blood. The wound was bad, but not immediately fatal. If she could tend to it quickly, he might survive. She had seen enough injuries on the ranch to recognize that much. She reached for the small medical kit her husband had left behind, her hand steady as she cleaned the wound and began stitching it up. The man groaned, his brow furrowing as he shifted in unconsciousness. His skin was hot to the touch, feverish. Sarah worked quickly, trying to bind the wound as best as she could. Her thoughts wandered as she worked. What if he woke and turned on her? What if he was one of those that had terrorized the homesteaders further north? But she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. The idea of leaving him there, to die alone in the desert, felt wrong, even if his people had brought suffering to so many. She had her own children to think of, her own safety to consider. But in that moment, Sarah Barnes made a choice. She had not been raised to stand idly by when someone needed help. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the man's breathing had steadied. His fever had broken, and he had slipped into a deep, exhausted sleep. Sarah sat beside him for a long while, staring at the sky, her mind heavy with the weight of her decision. There was no going back now. The Comanche raider, this stranger, was under her roof. He would stay until he could stand on his own, if he even made it that far. When the dawn came, she checked on him again. His wounds were still raw, but the bleeding had stopped. He was resting peacefully for the moment, his chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythms. Sarah felt the sting of uncertainty. She had made her choice, but it had no guarantees. She couldn't know what would happen once the man woke, once he realized where he was. He could be a threat, or he could simply be another person caught in the web of violence and survival that defined the frontier. But for now, there was only this moment, the man unconscious on her floor, and the heavy silence of the land beyond her door. She prepared breakfast for her children, their voices filling the house with the mundane chatter of a typical morning. Peter, the older of the two, was quick to ask about the man she had brought inside. Sarah's response was simple, and yet she could hear the weight of her decision in her own words. "He's a stranger," she said, "but he's hurt. We'll take care of him." The children nodded, sensing her tone. There were no questions asked, no fear in their eyes. They trusted her, as they always had. Sarah didn't have the heart to tell them the whole truth, not yet. They were too young to understand the complexities of mercy, and Sarah was not ready to explain the consequences of her choice. She simply moved through the day, carrying out the tasks that had once been shared with Thomas, the rhythm of the work a small comfort against the vast emptiness of the land. The raider remained in her care for days, the wound healing slowly but surely. During that time, Sarah kept to her routines, caring for her children and tending to the animals, while also keeping a careful watch on the man in her barn. She had no idea what he might do once he regained strength. But despite the fear that lingered like a shadow at the back of her mind, there was also something else, a growing sense of respect for the man she had saved, for the vulnerability he had shown. She had expected a brutal, savage man, but all she had seen so far was a broken figure, reliant on her for survival. And then, one morning, he woke. His eyes opened slowly, and for a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to make sense of the situation. She stayed still, watching him carefully. His features were sharp, the eyes dark and unreadable, but there was a faint spark of recognition in them. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. "You're safe here. For now." He didn't speak again, but his gaze never left her. And in that moment, the weight of his promise settled between them, unspoken but understood. The years that followed Sarah's decision to save Tacho felt like a blur, a shifting of seasons, each one bleeding into the next, much like the changing light across the land. Life on the ranch was not easy, but Sarah had grown accustomed to the solitude, the endless work of maintaining the property, and the quiet rhythms of everyday survival. She and her children, Peter, now a young man, and Ellie, growing into a bright, curious girl, had learned to make do. The world had not changed much for them. They lived simply, just as Thomas had wanted, though the absence of him was a constant ache in her chest. Tacho, once fully healed, had left without a word, disappearing back into the wild, as silently as he had come. Sarah had expected it. A man like him, bound by his own code and the unforgiving nature of the land, had no place in her life, no matter how deeply he had stirred her heart with his quiet gratitude. His promise, however, lingered like an ember in her thoughts. "I will return. You will not forget this." It was a promise, and yet she hadn't expected him to fulfill it. But life had a way of testing expectations. The first signs of trouble came from the east, where the Black River Raiders had begun to ravage the smaller settlements and ranches. They were a ruthless gang, led by the infamous Jackson Blackmore, whose name had become synonymous with terror. They didn't just steal cattle. They burned homes, killed indiscriminately, and took whatever they wanted, leaving destruction in their wake. For months, they moved steadily westward, causing fear and unease across the region. Every settler knew their name, and every town braced for the inevitable. Sarah had heard whispers of them, rumors from travelers passing through. Some said the raiders were too powerful to stop, that they were unstoppable. Others said they were a force of nature, like a storm that came and went without warning. But in all the stories, there was one constant. They would never spare the weak. They preyed on the vulnerable. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a rider appeared on the dusty horizon. It was dusk, the kind of evening where shadows stretched long, and the air turned cool and brittle. Sarah had been gathering firewood near the barn, and at first she thought the rider was a mirage, another weary traveler passing through. But as he came closer, she recognized the silhouette of the horse. Her heart skipped. Tacho! He didn't speak at first, simply dismounting and standing tall before her, his face unreadable beneath the darkening sky. Sarah froze, caught in a moment of disbelief. She had thought of him often in the years since his departure, but she had never expected him to return, especially not in such a time of danger. The Black River raiders were closing in, and here was the man who had promised her help, standing in her yard as if no time had passed. "I've heard what's coming," Tacho said, his voice steady, betraying no sign of emotion. "The Black River raiders. They're already near." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had known that danger was coming, had felt it in her bones, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "I'm not sure we can fight them off. I don't have the men, or the weapons, to face a gang like that." Tacho's eyes softened. "You don't have to fight alone." The words, simple and direct, hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a shiver of uncertainty, but also a strange sense of relief. He had returned, not just for her, but for the people of the land. She could feel it in the way he stood, as if he knew the battle was as much as hers. For the next few days, Tacho stayed, gathering supplies and preparing himself for what was to come. The small ranch, once a place of solitude, became a temporary base of operations. Sarah, unsure of what to do, simply followed his lead. It wasn't as if they had much choice. As the days passed, word of the Black River raiders' approach grew louder, like a drumbeat that could not be ignored. People fled, abandoning their homes, heading toward towns with more defenses. But Sarah could not leave her land, not yet, not when she had the chance to protect it. One evening, as Tacho worked in the barn, sharpening his knife, Sarah approached him. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she were testing the ground beneath her feet. She had to ask the question that had been gnawing at her since he'd arrived. "Why did you come back?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. The promise, the unspoken bond, the fear that had followed her in the years since he left. Tacho stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his dark eyes meeting hers. He was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if remembering something long buried. Finally, he spoke. "I promised you," he said, his voice low. "I don't break promises." His words were enough. They didn't need to be explained further. The unspoken understanding between them deepened in that moment. Tacho was a man of his word, and that was enough for Sarah. She wasn't sure how or when the Black River raiders would come, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone in the fight. As the night wore on, Tacho gathered a group of men, Comanche warriors who had been tracking the raiders in the shadows. They were silent figures, lean and determined, their faces painted with the markings of war. Sarah watched as Tacho addressed them, his voice low and commanding. These men were not just fighters. They were part of something larger, something older. She realized that this was no ordinary raider. Tacho wasn't just helping her. He was leading a resistance. His people, the Comanche, had been fighting this kind of war for generations. The land, the lawlessness, the violence, it was nothing new to them. The next morning, Sarah stood on the porch, watching as Tacho and his warriors prepared for the coming battle. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. Peter stood beside her, his young face drawn with worry. Ellie clung to her side, sensing the tension in the air. "Will we be safe?" Peter asked, his voice quiet, but his eyes searching hers for an answer. Sarah didn't know how to answer him. She could only offer a small, reassuring smile. "We'll fight, just like we always have." But she knew, deep down, that this fight was different. The Black River raiders were no mere band of outlaws. They were a force of nature, a storm of violence that could level everything in their path. Sarah had never been a warrior, and yet, as she looked at Tacho, standing with his men, she realized that they had a chance. Maybe not a good one, but a chance nonetheless. That afternoon, the raiders arrived. The sky had turned a dull gray, heavy with the threat of a storm, as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the riders approach. Dozens of them, clad in dark clothing, riding fast and with purpose. They were coming for her ranch, for everything she had fought to protect. Tacho stood at the edge of the yard, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the approaching threat. He gave a single, sharp command to his warriors, and they dispersed into the surrounding land, preparing for the inevitable clash. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the rifle she had kept for years, a symbol of her resilience. There was no turning back now. This was the moment her life had been leading up to. The fight had come to her doorstep. The battle between Tacho's warriors and the Black River Raiders raged with a ferocity that seemed to echo across the land. The sky was thick with dust and smoke, the air alive with the sharp crack of gunfire and the screams of men and horses. Sarah stood at the edge of the barn, the weight of the rifle in her hands like a lifeline. Peter and Ellie had taken shelter inside, but Sarah could not bring herself to stay away. She had promised herself that if her children were to witness war, it would not be as helpless bystanders. The raiders came like a storm, fast, relentless, and brutal. Tacho's men were swift, their movements calculated, yet the overwhelming numbers of the raiders made the battle feel like an uphill fight from the start. Sarah had seen enough of life on the frontier to know that the difference between survival and death was often a matter of mere seconds. The ground beneath her feet felt as if it were shifting, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders as she watched the chaos unfold before her. She had seen Tacho fight before, quick, lethal, and with the grace of a man born to the wild. But now, she saw something else in him. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt in his actions. He wasn't just a man protecting his land. He was a force of nature, a warrior whose past had carved him into something unforgiving. Yet, as Sarah watched him move through the fray, there was also something more, a tenderness, a determination not just to fight, but to protect what had been entrusted to him. As the battle dragged on, Sarah's attention was drawn to a figure at the rear of the raiders' camp. A man dressed in black, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, was watching the conflict with a cold, detached expression. Something about the way he stood, unmoving, caught Sarah's attention. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't rushing into the fight. He was watching. Then she saw it. The glint of recognition in Tacho's eyes when the man turned slightly, his gaze locking with Tacho's. It was the briefest of moments, but it was enough to send a chill through Sarah's spine. The man in black was Jackson Black Moore, the leader of the Black River Raiders. Her heart pounded in her chest. Moore was notorious, his name whispered with fear and hatred by anyone who had survived an encounter with him. He was a legend of violence, the kind of man who would burn a town to the ground and not think twice. And now, he was here, on her land, in the middle of a fight she could barely comprehend. Tacho moved like lightning, his warriors rallying around him. The Comanche were skilled, their knowledge of the land giving them an advantage, but Moore's raiders were relentless. The sound of gunfire rang in her ears, each shot a reminder of how thin the line between life and death really was. Sarah didn't know how long it had been, but she could feel the fight wearing on her. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and sweat, and the ground beneath her feet had become slick with mud and blood. She glanced back toward the barn. Peter and Ellie were safe, at least for now. But she could sense the tide of battle turning. Moore's raiders were pushing forward, slowly overpowering Tacho's warriors. Tacho seemed to be everywhere at once, cutting through the raiders with precision, his blade flashing in the sun like a deadly arc. But even he seemed to be struggling against the sheer numbers of the raiders. The battle was dragging on, and Sarah could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had never intended for her land to become a battleground, and now, with the sound of violence filling the air, she realized that she couldn't just wait. She had to do something. She took a steadying breath, forcing her hands to grip the rifle tightly. Her fingers trembled as she aimed. The rifle sighted on a group of raiders, making their way toward Tacho's position. Sarah had never been a great shot, but she knew how to defend herself, and her family, when the need arose. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and one of the raiders fell. Another took cover, ducking behind a pile of old crates. The moment of surprise was brief, but it was enough. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the men scramble for cover, their attention momentarily diverted. She was no longer just a bystander. She had taken a stand, and in that moment, she realized she wasn't about to let her home fall without a fight. The tide of battle shifted again, but it was no longer the Comanche or the raiders who defined the fight. It was the land, the very earth beneath their feet, that seemed to rise up against the invaders. The wind picked up, howling across the canyon, sweeping sand and dust into the faces of the raiders. In that brief moment of disarray, Tacho rallied his warriors, his voice cutting through the noise. Sarah didn't know how long it lasted, but in the end, the Black River Raiders began to retreat. The sound of their footsteps, the thundering hooves of their horses, faded into the distance as they turned and fled. The battle was over, at least for now. But as the dust settled and the chaos subsided, Sarah's gaze returned to the man in black, the one who had stood at the edge of the battle, watching it all unfold. Jackson Moore had not fought. He had simply observed. Tacho stood tall, his chest heaving as he surveyed the battlefield. He was covered in blood, sweat, and dirt, but he was alive. His warriors had fought with honor, and while they had lost men, they had won the day. But it was clear that this was only the beginning. Jackson Moore had not come for just one battle. He had come for war. Sarah approached Tacho as he wiped the blood from his hands, his expression hardening as he glanced in the direction the raiders had fled. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice rough from the fight. "Moore will come back." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their home, their land, would never be the same again. But there was something else in her eyes, a fierce determination. "We'll be ready." Tacho met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of years, he spoke again. "Jackson Moore is no ordinary man. He's the end of a long road. I've crossed him before, and now he'll come for what's mine. What's ours?" Sarah's heart sank at the words, but she held her ground. The world had changed. The peaceful, quiet life she had once known was gone, replaced by a new reality, a reality where survival meant more than just living. It meant fighting, holding on to what was yours, even when the odds seemed impossible. The sound of horses in the distance broke the silence, and Sarah's hand instinctively went to the rifle at her side. But it wasn't the raiders returning. It was Tacho's warriors, riding back toward the ranch, their faces grim but resolute. "Get ready," Tacho said, his voice low. "The war is just beginning." And as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting a blood-red hue over the battlefield, Sarah realized that this was not just a fight for her land. It was a fight for everything she held dear, and it would take all the strength she had, and all the strength Tacho could offer, to survive it. The weeks after the battle passed slowly, each day dragging like the slow crawl of a storm across the horizon. The air, once heavy with dust and smoke, had settled into an uneasy calm. The Black River Raiders had not returned, but their leader, Jackson Moore, was still a shadow on the land. His absence only fueled Sarah's anxiety. She knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ranch had been spared for now, but Tacho's warriors, having made their stand, had dispersed, slipping back into the wilderness, where they belonged. They had left behind no promises, only the weight of knowing that their fight was far from finished. Tacho had remained, though, standing at Sarah's side, watching over the land. His presence was like a quiet constant, distant, yet ever watchful. Days blended together, and Sarah found herself lingering more often at the edge of the ranch, her eyes searching the horizon. Peter had taken to helping Tacho in the mornings, learning the ways of the Comanche, while Ellie stayed close to Sarah, often asking when things would go back to normal. But Sarah knew deep down that there was no normal to return to. The world had shifted, and so had she. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the valley, casting long shadows across the dry earth, Sarah found herself standing outside, staring into the gathering dusk. The wind was soft, but the silence was thick with something unspoken. She turned when she heard Tacho approaching, his familiar steps crunching the dirt behind her. "I'm going to leave," Tacho said quietly. The words, though simple, carried the weight of something much deeper. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only a quiet resignation. He was stating a fact, not making a request. Sarah's heart stilled for a moment. She had known this day might come, but it was harder than she had imagined. She'd grown used to his presence, to the steady, silent way he carried himself. He had become a fixture in her life, a protector in a world that had offered her little protection. "Where will you go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tacho paused, his dark eyes scanning the distant hills. "The fight isn't over. Jackson Moore will come back. He'll bring more men, more destruction. I can't stay here, not while that man is out there. I have to go after him." The words stung, but Sarah knew they were true. Moore was a man who would never let a slight go unpunished. He would return, and when he did, he would bring war with him. "I don't want you to go," Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure why she felt so strongly. Maybe it was because, in Tacho, she saw something she had lost when her husband died, a sense of purpose, of resolve. But more than that, she had come to trust him. In the chaos of the world they lived in, trust had become a rare currency, and Tacho had earned it. He looked at her then, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "I have to do this. For you. For them." He nodded toward Peter and Ellie, who were on the porch, watching from a distance. "This fight isn't just about survival, it's about something more. Something worth fighting for." Sarah's chest tightened. She had never been someone who had asked for help. But now, in the face of this larger threat, she found herself helpless in a way she hadn't expected. She had always been the one to protect her family, the one who had learned to fight for what was hers. But in Tacho, she saw something different, something more primal, more fierce. "Is that why you came back?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "To protect us?" Tacho's expression hardened again, the mask he wore slipping back into place. "I came back because I owe you. Because you showed me mercy when I didn't deserve it. No one else would have done that. And now, I'll make sure you're safe." But even as he said the words, Sarah felt a sense of unease settle in her stomach. There was something more. She had known for a long time that Tacho wasn't just a man of the land. He wasn't just a warrior from a distant tribe. He had a past, a history that stretched back further than she could imagine. "You don't owe me," she said softly, "but I owe you something too." Tacho's eyes flickered with something. Was it surprise? Regret? But before Sarah could continue, a new sound reached their ears, a distant rumble on the wind. The horses. Tacho's warriors. The sound of the approaching horses brought them both back to reality. Tacho's warriors were riding back toward the ranch, their faces grim, their expressions hard. Tacho's gaze hardened too, his body going still, like a predator sensing danger. "They're here," Tacho said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. He turned away from her, his focus shifting to the horizon where the riders approached. Sarah didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. In the distance, Jackson Moore's raiders were riding in. They had returned, just as Tacho had predicted, and with them came an ominous, oppressive sense of finality. Tacho moved swiftly, his movements decisive. He grabbed his rifle, the long, curved blade of his knife gleaming in the dying light. Sarah, too, grabbed her rifle, feeling the weight of it like never before. This was the moment she had feared, the one she had known was coming. It was here. Tacho turned to Sarah one last time before he left, his eyes locking with hers. For the first time, he didn't hide his emotions. There was a sadness there, something unspoken, and Sarah felt it too. He wasn't just leaving to fight. He was leaving because he had to, because this was his war. And there was no way to avoid it, not for him, and not for her. "You have your own fight now," Tacho said, his voice steady. "This is your land, your home. It's time you fought for it." With that, he turned away and mounted his horse, spurring the animal into motion. The sound of hooves pounding against the earth reverberated in Sarah's chest. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of clarity. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She wasn't just a mother protecting her children. She was a part of this land, just like Tacho, just like the warriors who had come before them. She was a protector too. And as the dust rose from the ground, and the distant sound of the raiders grew louder, Sarah made a choice. She would no longer wait for others to protect her. She would stand with Tacho, stand with the land, and stand against the storm that was coming. For this fight, she would be the hero of her own story.